My boss fired me 2 hours after I told him I was pregnant. 18 months later, he signed a contract that put me in charge of every woman they're allowed to hire. I didn't cry when he fired me. I thought I would, honestly. I'd played it out 100 times in my head ever since I saw the faint second line on the pregnancy test. I'd imagined breaking down in the elevator, rushing to the restroom, and sobbing behind a locked stall, or maybe even begging just a little for my seat at the table. But when it actually happened, I didn't cry. I just sat there in the same chair where I had pitched 3 product launches, where I had received a standing ovation for the Q2 turnaround strategy, where he once said, verbatim, "You're the engine of this team." And now his voice was cold-clipped managerial. "This isn't personal, Emily. We're restructuring. You haven't been here long enough to be guaranteed a long-term seat. You're talented. You'll land on your feet." My hands were resting on the soft slope of my belly, barely visible beneath the fitted charcoal dress I had worn so carefully. I told myself it was still too early to show, still early enough to fight for my job, but apparently not early enough to be invisible. I had told him not 10 minutes earlier. I had walked into his office with my pulse fluttering at my collarbone, and said it simple, honest, "I'm pregnant." And now I sat across from him hearing words like restructure, future planning, contractual flexibility, all while my body was already stretching to hold a new life I wasn't even sure I could protect. I remember staring at the mug on his desk. It said "Rise and Grind" in all caps white font. I had given him that mug last Christmas. God, that's pathetic. I remember thinking I should say something, ask for clarity, call it what it was, maybe even shout. But all I could manage was a quiet, "Okay." And then I stood up, not because I was ready, but because sitting there made it harder to breathe. My heels clacked against the floor as I walked back to my desk. I didn't even pack everything, just grabbed my laptop, a framed photo of Luke and me on the coast, and the lemon ginger tea I'd been sipping to ward off the nausea. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped the mug. No one looked up. No one said anything. I guess they had already been briefed. Or maybe they were just too afraid of catching my humiliation like a virus. In the elevator, I tried to steady myself, gripping the railing, staring at my reflection in the mirrored wall. I looked polished, intact. The kind of woman who didn't get fired. The kind of woman who had outperformed every single quarterly target since joining the company. The kind of woman who once stayed up 52 hours straight to fix a launch bug. And now I was unemployed at 17 weeks pregnant, holding a useless laptop and a warm mug of tea. The elevator doors opened and I stepped out into the parking garage. I stood there for a while, trying to remember where I'd parked. I ended up just sitting on the curb, knees, pulled close, forehead resting on my arms, and I stayed there for almost an hour. I wasn't crying. I wish I had. It would have made sense. But there was nothing, just this hollowness, like someone had scooped the air out of my chest. When I finally got home, Luke was still on a call. He gave me a thumbs up from across the room and mouthed, "Okay." I nodded. I lied. I went straight to the bathroom, locked the door, and threw up into the sink. Not from morning sickness, just from everything. The silence, the erasure, the way they made it sound like a business decision, like I was being let go because of numbers instead of biology. But I knew I wasn't naive. They couldn't say it directly, but the message was loud enough. Pregnant women don't scale. Pregnant women take breaks. Pregnant women aren't warriors. I sat on the cold tile floor, cheek against the porcelain bathtub, and whispered to myself, "You shouldn't have said anything. You should have waited." And maybe that's what broke me, not the firing, but the fact that I was blaming myself for being honest, for being human, for carrying a child. Later that night, I got an email. It was a formality, really. A PDF attachment, HR copy-pasted language about contract conclusion access, revoked benefits, terminated by the end of the month. No thank you, no recognition. Not even a single line that acknowledged the months, no years I had poured into that place. I had canceled vacations, missed weddings, delayed my own engagement so we could hit product milestones. I had said no to life so many times for that job. And all I got in return was a 6-sentence email and a canned apology. I stared at my inbox until my vision blurred. Then I marked it unread and shut the laptop. I didn't touch it for days. But the worst part wasn't losing the job. It was the silence that followed. People I mentored, people I fought for in meetings, people who once called me at midnight asking for help on slide decks, all gone. No one reached out. No one asked what happened. They just moved on like I was a footnote. And maybe I was. Maybe that's all women like me ever are in places like that until we become inconvenient. I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, one hand on my belly, and I made myself a promise. I wouldn't disappear. Not like this. Not quietly. Not forever. Sometimes I wonder if I ever really had a life outside of that job, or if I just convinced myself that ambition was enough. There were years, whole stretches of my 20s, where my apartment felt more like a hotel room I occasionally slept in between product launches and investor pitches. I used to tell people I loved the grind, that I thrived under pressure, that I didn't need a social life or weekends or even sleep. I wore burnout like a badge of honor. At the time, it felt powerful. It made me feel like I was part of something bigger, like I was climbing towards something that would eventually make all the sacrifices make sense. But now, I look back and I don't remember what it was I thought I was chasing. I remember meetings, deadlines, red-eye flights. I remember ordering dinner to the office so many times the front desk started greeting me by name. I remember learning how to sleep upright in an office chair. I remember canceling an anniversary dinner with Luke because a last-minute investor call just couldn't wait. He said he understood. He always said that. I don't think I ever told anyone this, but I was supposed to get married 2 years ago. We had a date, a venue. I even had a dress. But the company was in the middle of Series B, and I was leading product strategy. The pressure was suffocating. I told Luke we should postpone. Just 6 months, I said. We'll do it properly, not in the middle of all this chaos. He looked at me for a long time before he nodded, and we never rescheduled. I told myself I was choosing my future, that this was temporary, that once we IPO'd, once the stress settled, once I made VP, then I'd have time for vows and family and dinners that didn't come in takeout boxes. I kept deferring life for the job, over and over again, until one day, without warning, the job walked away, and all those years I'd traded for it turned to ash in my hands. People think betrayal is a sharp thing, sudden, painful, loud. But what they don't realize is that sometimes betrayal is quiet. It's the sound of a door closing softly behind you while you're still sitting in the room. It's the way your email stops receiving updates before you even realize you've been erased. It's a message from HR with a subject line so sterile it almost feels polite. No one shouted. No one insulted me. But their silence said everything. They didn't see me as someone worth fighting for. I had given them everything, and they didn't even flinch when they let me go. What I didn't expect was how quickly the world kept moving. I kept thinking someone would reach out, that maybe after a few days someone from my old team would call and ask if I was okay. But the only messages I got were LinkedIn notifications. A few people liked my moving on to new opportunities post. A couple of generic comments. Wishing you the best, you'll land somewhere amazing. No one asked what happened. No one mentioned the pregnancy. I felt like I was mourning something I wasn't allowed to grieve out loud. Like I had to pretend it was just a job change, just another professional pivot. But it wasn't. It was a rupture, a collapse of everything I had built my identity around. I wasn't just unemployed. I was untethered. Luke was kind. He offered to take time off work, help me figure things out. But I could see the worry in his eyes. Not about money we had savings, but about me. I was withdrawing. I barely left the apartment. I stopped answering texts. I stopped showering some days. I remember sitting on the couch for hours just scrolling through job postings I knew wouldn't call me back. Who wants to hire a visibly pregnant woman with a recent contract termination on her record? I knew the answer. They'd never say it out loud, but I knew. I was radioactive. One afternoon, I got a calendar notification by accident. I hadn't unsubscribed from the company updates yet. It was a reminder for the product strategy call I used to lead every Tuesday. I stared at it for a long time. Then, without thinking, I clicked the Zoom link. I didn't join, of course, but I watched the waiting room screen, just sat there watching names pop in. Names I used to manage, people I used to mentor. I watched for 15 minutes before closing the window. And then I cried, really cried. For the first time since that morning in his office. It wasn't the meeting that broke me. It was the realization that they didn't need me. That life was going on and I was no longer in it. That night, Luke made pasta. He lit a candle, tried to make it feel like a date night. I appreciated the effort, even smiled for a bit. but I could feel the crack beneath my skin, the place where everything had unraveled. After dinner, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and tried to write. I used to journal all the time. But when I opened the notebook, nothing came. Just a blank page. Just silence. And then out of nowhere, I wrote one sentence. I was not disposable. It startled me how forceful it felt. I underlined it. Then I wrote another. This isn't how I disappear. I didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning. That was the spark. I didn't plan on starting anything. I wasn't trying to be strong or inspiring or strategic. I was just trying not to drown. After that night by the window, I kept writing, not in a journal this time, but in long, unsent emails. I wrote them to the women I used to know, to my mother, to no one in particular. Stories poured out of me, not just my own, but pieces of conversations I'd overheard in office bathrooms. The things women say in whispers after meetings when the doors are finally closed. I'm 3 months along, but don't tell anyone yet. They're already looking for my replacement. I came back from maternity leave, and my desk had been reassigned. I remembered them all, and I wrote them down. Then one day on a whim, I posted a short paragraph on Medium under a pseudonym. Just a fragment. They said I wasn't committed, because I chose to grow 2 things at once, my career and a child. Apparently that's one too many. I closed the laptop expecting nothing. By morning it had over 4,000 views. I stared at the screen blinking. Comments flooded in, not trolls, not skeptics, but women, hundreds of them, thanking me, sharing their own stories. One said she'd been let go the day after announcing her pregnancy. Another said her team stopped including her in meetings once she started to show. A third had been demoted while on leave. I spent hours reading them, heart-pounding. It was like opening a dam I didn't know existed. I created a separate email just to manage the responses. I called it the re-entry room. It sounded professional, but also soft, forgiving, like a place you could walk into barefoot, exhausted, and still be allowed to belong. At first, it was just a newsletter. Every Friday, I'd send out one essay, sometimes my own, sometimes guest stories, anonymized but sharp, real, raw, the kind of truths that make people uncomfortable. I didn't expect it to grow, but it did. Week by week, the list doubled, then tripled. A friend helped me build a simple website, no frills, just a place to archive the posts. I added a few downloadable resources, how to file for leave, what to ask HR, legal templates if you were being pushed out. They weren't fancy, just functional. But women used them. They shared them. They printed them out and took them into meetings. Somewhere in all of that, I started breathing again. Not fully, not freely, but I felt something shift. Like I was slowly reclaiming oxygen. Luke noticed. He said I seemed lighter. I didn't feel light. I felt anchored. I had something to pour into again. Something that wasn't my grief. Something that didn't care if I had a job title or not. But even as this little project grew, I couldn't stop watching them, my old company, from the outside. It became a quiet ritual, almost obsessive. I'd check their LinkedIn posts, track their press releases, watch who they promoted, who they let go. I wasn't looking for closure. I was looking for proof. Proof that I wasn't crazy. That what they did to me wasn't justifiable. That maybe they were finally getting called out. Instead, I found something else. Something that turned the quiet grief in my chest into something sharper, colder. I noticed they had launched a new women's initiative. A glossy campaign with pastel graphics and hashtags about equity and empowerment. They posted a photo of a panel, 3 male executives and 1 woman who had joined the company the month after I left. They called her a trailblazer in women's leadership. I stared at the photo, jaw clenched. I wasn't angry that they moved on. I was angry they were using my story as cover. That they had quietly erased me, then built a PR narrative around being progressive. They didn't change. They just changed the optics. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the women who wrote me. The ones who said they stayed silent because they didn't want to lose health insurance. The ones who walked away without severance because they were too tired to fight. I wasn't the only one. I was just one of many, and that's what terrified me. Because for every email I received, there were hundreds more not written. Every system I had once believed in, performance reviews, HR channels, team values, they weren't broken. They were working exactly as designed, just not for us. I started keeping a spreadsheet, not for revenge, just to keep track. patterns, dates, industries, names when people were willing to share them. It wasn't formal, but it started to look like something more, a map, a mosaic of quiet exits and erased contributions. I told myself it was just research, but the truth is, I was building something. I just didn't know it yet. What I did know clearly, painfully, was this: I had spent too long believing that loyalty was armor. That if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, proved myself over and over, the system would protect me. But it never had, and it never would. I wasn't protected. I was polite, and politeness is just the mask they give us to wear while they walk us out. The shift didn't happen all at once. It wasn't some dramatic lightning bolt or a sudden sense of purpose. It came slowly in pieces, like light creeping through the slats of a window you didn't realize had been shut. By the time I was 28 weeks pregnant, I should have been preparing for maternity leave, nursery colors, pediatrician appointments, packing a hospital bag. But instead, I was hunched over my laptop most nights, reading stories from women who sounded like echoes of myself. The baby was kicking more now, stronger, almost rhythmic. It used to scare me, that tiny thump inside me, like a reminder of how vulnerable I'd become. But now each movement felt like a push forward, a rhythm I could lean into. One night I got an email that shook me more than I expected. It was a press release someone had forwarded to the re-entry room's inbox. My former company was announcing their new Women in Tech initiative, complete with glossy branding and the promise of an inclusive culture. My ex-CEO was quoted saying, "We believe motherhood should be seen as a strategic asset, not a liability." I read it 3 times, barely breathing. I had pitched those exact words once in a deck 2 years ago. They'd dismissed the idea back then, told me we didn't have the bandwidth for soft programs. And now they were parading them like trophies. No credit, no trace of where it started. Just clean branding, investor-friendly language, and a photo of an all-male executive team standing beneath a banner that read, #EmpowerMothers. I don't remember standing up. I just remember pacing barefoot, one hand on the small of my back, the other clenched into a fist. I wanted to scream. Not just because they were lying, but because they were succeeding. They had taken everything I gave, erased my name from it, and wrapped it up as innovation. And the world was clapping for them. I sat back down, trembling, and stared at the cursor blinking on the screen. I opened a new document and typed a single sentence: "What if we made staying in the workforce after birth not just possible but powerful?" At first, I didn't know what I was writing. I wasn't trying to build anything. I just needed to get the rot out of my chest. But as I kept typing, an idea started forming, not abstract, not aspirational. Practical, concrete. What if there were a system that didn't treat mothers as a risk? What if there were a platform that helped women transition back into work on their terms without apology? I thought about all the women who had written to me through the re-entry room. Smart, capable, quietly devastated. They didn't need sympathy. They needed infrastructure, opportunity, recognition, not handouts, not hashtags, just access and truth. I called a friend from college, Jess. She'd been a UX designer before leaving the agency world after her second kid. I told her I had a messy vision for a tool that could change the return-to-work landscape. Something that vetted companies before they ever saw our talent, that offered legal templates, financial coaching, and real community support. She was skeptical at first, then intrigued, then in. We sketched the first layout in Figma 3 days later while I balanced my laptop on a pillow that doubled as a makeshift pregnancy support. The project needed a name. I didn't want something soft or apologetic. I didn't want anything that sounded like we were trying to squeeze women back into old roles. I wanted steel, intention. I kept thinking about something one of the women said to me on a late-night Zoom call. She had been a senior engineer before getting laid off during her 3rd trimester. When I asked how she was coping, she said, "I'm not broken, just cooling like metal after fire." And there it was, the word reforge. By the time I reached week 30, we had a demo, a mailing list of over $6,000, and a short list of employers who had heard whispers and wanted early access. We didn't advertise. We didn't pitch. The women came first. I built the platform like I was building armor for us all. Every template, every module, every line of code designed. Not to fix us, but to honor us. We weren't starting over. We were re-entering on our terms. But I couldn't shake the quiet bitterness. Because while I was pouring everything I had into this platform, I kept watching them. My former company, Their new head of culture, a man who once told me that maternity leave was basically a sabbatical, was now giving interviews about inclusion. They had partnered with a VC firm to launch a Moms in Leadership fund. I watched them pose with strollers they didn't push, holding babies that weren't theirs, basking in the glory of a revolution they didn't believe in until it became marketable. The anger stayed with me, not fiery anymore, just constant. Like a low hum, it made me sharper, focused. My baby was due in 8 weeks, and I was building something faster than I ever had. Jess and I worked in 4-hour windows timed between naps and nausea and pelvic pain. It was chaotic, but it was ours. And for the first time in months, I felt capable. Not just surviving, creating. Not in spite of motherhood, but because of it. I didn't post updates. I didn't write Medium articles or tweet threads. I kept it quiet. Intentional, understated. Because I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I was building proof. Something they couldn't co-opt. Something they'd need more than I needed them. Giving birth felt nothing like the movies. There was no cinematic swelling of music, no soft glow of triumph as I held my baby for the first time. It was blood and breath and panic and silence. It was 16 hours of labor, a nurse named Carla who held my hand during the worst of it, and a ceiling tile I stared at for so long it feels etched into my memory. Luke was there, gentle, scared, trying so hard to be strong for me, but I was somewhere else entirely. Not disassociated, not broken, just emptied. Like everything had already been taken and I was offering up what little remained. When they placed her in my arms, I didn't cry. I just stared. She was so small, so fierce already, eyes scrunched tight, fists balled like she was ready to fight the whole world. I whispered, "I see you," even though she couldn't hear me. And maybe selfishly, I was saying it to myself. The first few weeks blurred. My body was wrecked, sleep was a myth, and time lost all shape. But what surprised me most wasn't the exhaustion, it was the loneliness. Everyone talks about the village, about the outpouring of support new mothers are supposed to receive. I didn't have that. My parents were too far away and too awkward with emotion. Friends sent flowers, some dropped off meals, but the calls dwindled, the texts dried up. People didn't know what to say to me anymore. I wasn't Emily from Product Strategy or Emily the Firecracker. I was just someone who had fallen out of orbit. A cautionary tale. The girl who burned too hot and got left behind. Even the women who once filled my inbox with solidarity began to fade. Not out of malice, just life. They had their own babies, their own jobs to fight for. And I was now that kind of woman. The one with a newborn and a startup and no clear plan for either. Worse were the comments, the quiet, cutting ones. A well-meaning acquaintance asked if I was going to finally slow down and focus on being a mom. Someone else gently suggested I put Reforge on hold until the baby was older. One woman, another founder, told me smiling that investors don't like messy narratives, and maybe I should wait to raise until I looked more stable, as if the mere fact of my motherhood had destabilized me, as if carrying life, birthing life, recovering from it, and still trying to build something meant I was chaotic, unfocused, a risk. I smiled, I nodded, and I swallowed every response I wanted to scream. Even Luke, for all his support, didn't fully see it. He praised me for doing it all but gently flinched every time I mentioned pushing the launch sooner. He said I needed rest, and he was right. But it wasn't rest I craved, it was relevance. I needed to believe I still mattered outside of feedings and swaddles and white noise machines. I needed to believe that the part of me that once could run a room still had breath left in her. So I worked quietly during 2 a.m. nursing sessions and short naps, stealing pockets of time like a criminal. Jess kept things afloat during the day. I took over at night. We onboarded 5 employers, soft-launched our matching algorithm, and were featured in a small write-up on a Women in Tech newsletter. It wasn't huge, but it was real. And yet it didn't feel like enough. I couldn't shake the sense that I was still on the outside looking in. That no matter how well Reforge did, I had already lost something essential. Not the job, not the title, but my legitimacy. I saw it in people's eyes when I introduced myself now. The slight pause after I'm working on a return-to-work platform for mothers. The polite smile. The mental note, she's not serious anymore. I was no longer the woman in heels giving keynotes. I was the woman in leggings, pushing a stroller trying to pitch between nap windows. And the world doesn't like its visionaries messy. It doesn't trust women who bleed and build at the same time. Still, I kept building, not because I was brave, not even because I was angry, but because I didn't know how not to. The silence had carved out a space inside me, and I was determined to fill it with something louder than my own erasure. We launched our first return-to-work cohort 6 weeks postpartum, 15 women, all from different industries. All brilliant, all discarded. Some had left voluntarily after their companies made their lives unbearable. Others had been quietly pushed out. One had been demoted while on bed rest. Another was told she had too much emotional weight to lead a team. I listened to their stories and saw my own reflected back, not identically, but unmistakably. And it lit something inside me, not rage, not vengeance. Just this quiet, stubborn insistence that they deserved better, that we all did. We ran that cohort for 8 weeks. At the end, 13 of them had job offers, real ones, from companies that actually supported flexibility, parental leave, remote options, career coaching. Reforge wasn't just working. It was proving something, and yet even then I felt the weight of how far there still was to go. Every win was a whisper against a roaring machine. Every success felt fragile, but it was mine, ours. One night as I stood rocking my daughter to sleep, her warm cheek against my chest, I thought back to the girl I used to be. The one who stayed late for meetings, who skipped meals and birthdays and anniversaries for someone else's dream. And I whispered to my daughter, barely audible, "We don't beg to belong. Not anymore." She didn't understand, of course. But maybe someday she would. Maybe she'd inherit not just the platform, but the fire behind it. Maybe the world would be different by then, or maybe it wouldn't. But either way, I'd keep going. Momentum is a strange thing. At first it feels like luck. Like the universe finally tossing you a bone after stripping you bare. But then it builds, quietly, relentlessly. Like a tide you didn't realize was rising until you look up and see the shoreline behind you. That's what Reforge became. Not a project, not a post-baby experiment, but a movement. We onboarded 200 women in the span of 2 months. Our retention rate was nearly perfect. The companies we partnered with didn't just want good PR. They wanted what we curated: talent that had survived real pressure, built resilience in silence, and came back sharper. Our second cohort had 4 women land director-level roles. One joined the board of a sustainability startup. Another launched her own AI consultancy after being rejected for losing edge during her time off. I watched them rise, not with gratitude but with clarity. They weren't lucky. They were overdue. The money came next. I'd been careful, bootstrapped everything. But at some point, you hit a ceiling that passion and spreadsheets can't scale. Jess and I spent 2 weeks building a data deck. Success rates, growth curves, case studies. I practiced the pitch during 4 a.m. feedings, whispering ROI metrics while pacing the kitchen with a baby on my shoulder. I only sent it to women-led funds. If they didn't get it, they wouldn't fake it. And to my surprise, they did get it. Fast. We secured a 1.2 million pre-seed in less than 6 weeks. Clean cap table, founder control intact. The press noticed. Not a front-page spread, but quiet, meaningful headlines. Motherhood meets momentum. Reforge. Raises to rebuild the workforce. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Not yet. I think part of me always knew the moment would come, that point in every arc, where the past comes knocking, not in apology, but in need. It arrived on a Wednesday in the form of a referral email. One of our partnered VCs had recommended Reforge to a mid-sized tech firm seeking to rebuild its talent pipeline. They'd grown too fast, burned too many bridges, and needed a clean slate to attract mid-career hires with family experience. They didn't mention the company's name in the subject line, but when I opened the deck, I recognized the logo instantly. My old company, still branding itself as a champion of equity, still using the same font, the same tagline I'd once pitched for a now-defunct campaign: build forward, bring everyone. They wanted access to our network, our women, our reputation. For a moment, I froze. My cursor hovered over the reply button. I could taste the irony. The same CEO who had let me go for being unreliable, his exact word, now needed us to rebuild his company's trust. Not because he believed in us, but because his numbers were slipping. Their last product failed. Their Glassdoor reviews were tanking. And suddenly mothers weren't a liability, they were leverage. I closed the laptop and sat very still. not out of shock, but to remind myself not to feel triumphant. This wasn't victory, not yet. This was positioning. I waited 2 days before responding. I wrote politely, professionally, offering a consultation call to explore alignment. I made sure our team treated them no differently than anyone else. No snide remarks, no passive aggression. Just process. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that every step of this was mine now. The intake form, the evaluation criteria, the metrics we measured designed by me. They didn't know they were walking into a system built by the woman they discarded, and I wasn't going to tell them. I wanted them to discover it slowly, like stepping into a house they used to own, only to realize every wall had been rebuilt without their name on the deed. During the call, their head of HR smiled too much. Overcompensating. She spoke about turning a new chapter, about authentic inclusion, about learning from the past. I nodded. I asked questions. I took notes. And then just before the end, she said, "We'd love to host a public signing announcement. Get our CEO involved. It would mean a lot to us symbolically." I said I'd think about it, but inside I already knew. I wasn't going to give them symbolism. I was going to give them structure. 2 weeks later, we sent over the contract. It was long, surgical. It outlined required compensation policies, flexible work guarantees, a bias reporting mechanism, and annual accountability audits managed by our compliance team. And at the very bottom, in small but legally binding print, was the name of the strategic oversight lead, me. They signed. They didn't even flinch, because they couldn't afford to anymore. Their metrics were tanking, their competitors were climbing, and we were the only credible pipeline they hadn't burned yet. I watched the contract come through at 11:12 p.m. on a Thursday. I stared at it, the logo, the signature, my title beneath it. No tears, no gloating, just stillness. I didn't tell Luke. I didn't post about it. I didn't even tell Jess. I just closed the document, walked into my daughter's room, and stood over her crib. She was sleeping, one arm tossed over her head like she owned the world. And maybe she did. Or maybe I had just given her a better shot at it. Either way, I whispered the same thing I told myself the day I was fired. This isn't how I disappear. Only now I wasn't disappearing. I was defining the terms. I wasn't supposed to be there. That's what made it perfect. The official signing event was small, mostly for internal use. Some light media presence, a few photographers, nothing flashy. Their PR team wanted to spin it as a strategic values alignment, which made me laugh in the privacy of my own mind. Strategic was right. They needed the partnership more than they were willing to admit. What they didn't realize was that this wasn't just another vendor agreement. This was infrastructure, control. Once the contract was live, every one of their diversity metrics would be tied to quarterly check-ins with us. Every hiring pipeline, every return to work case, every policy adjustment, they'd flow through Reforge. Through me. Jess had planned to attend in my place. I told her she could handle it. But the night before, I changed my mind. Not out of revenge, just clarity. Some things you show up for, not to prove yourself, but to witness what happens when silence builds power. I wore black, no branding, no statement. Just clean lines and sharp heels that reminded me of the version of myself I thought I'd buried under burp cloths and invoices. I slipped in just before the event started. No one recognized me. I blended into the back of the room, watching them arrange bottled water and branded folders. It was surreal. A room I would have once led, now orbiting around an initiative born from my exit. Then he walked in. The CEO. Same posture, same calculated stride, but older, slightly wearier. He shook hands with Jess, smiled at the cameras, and settled into his seat like he still owned every table he touched. I wondered briefly what he thought he was walking into. A handshake, a photo, another box checked on some ESG scorecard. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He started with a speech, short, practiced, generic. He thanked the Reforge team. He spoke about redefining value. And then in a moment of forced humility, he added, "When we make mistakes, we have to do more than apologize. We have to adapt." There it was, a shadow of an admission. Not to me, not by name, but enough to make my pulse quicken. Jess stepped up next. Her voice was calm, clear, strong. She outlined what the partnership meant, not just in optics, but in execution. She detailed the accountability metrics, the compliance oversight, the advisory sessions. She read the names of the core architects of the Reforge framework. And when she said mine, his head tilted slightly. No reaction, no change in expression. But I saw it, the flicker, like a record scratch behind his eyes. He looked out at the room searching, but I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just stood at the back still as stone while the spotlight slid past me. When it came time to sign, he reached for the pen like it meant nothing. I watched him press ink to paper on a contract that made me his gatekeeper, his access point. The woman he'd dismissed for being unavailable was now the reason he'd be allowed to rebuild. And he didn't even know. Or maybe deep down he did. Maybe he was hoping I wouldn't show, that I'd stay a name in a footer, a signature in fine print. But I was there, watching, breathing, entirely intact. After the signing, there were photos, light applause, and awkward mingling. I stayed in the shadows, just out of frame, until Jess turned, made eye contact with me, and gave the smallest nod, an invitation. I didn't hesitate. I walked forward, not to him, but to the center of the room. Someone handed me a mic without asking who I was. I took it. And calmly I said, Reforge wasn't built to correct a mistake. It was built to make sure women never become one. Silence fell. Not heavy, just quiet. Like a breath being held across an entire room. I didn't say more. I didn't need to. I handed the mic back and turned to leave. As I passed him, our eyes met for a second. His mouth opened slightly, maybe to speak. Maybe just to breathe. But I kept walking, past the cameras, past the curated smiles, past the company that once erased me. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, clean. I exhaled slowly, hands steady, heels clicking against the pavement like punctuation. There were no fireworks, no confetti, no breaking news alerts. Just the quiet certainty that I had come full circle and never had to raise my voice to do it. I don't talk about him anymore, not in interviews, not in panels, not even in the quiet conversations women have when the cameras are off and the real questions begin. I don't name him, I don't reference the company, and I don't offer some inspirational soundbite about how getting fired was a blessing in disguise. Because it wasn't, it was a wound. And some wounds don't need to be wrapped in silver linings, they just need to be honored. I let it cut, I let it scar, and then I let it close. These days, my life is quieter, not small, just quieter. We moved out of the city 6 months ago, found a little house near the edge of a state park. Big windows, creaky floors, a vegetable garden I don't quite know how to tend. Luke and I still have rough days, but we're stronger now. Not in the way movies show couples holding hands through trauma, but in the way people stay when the anger is gone and only the work remains. He never asked me to slow down again, and I never needed to justify why I wouldn't. Our daughter is almost 1. She walks with that unsteady defiance only babies know. Like the world hasn't told her yet that gravity wins. She has my eyes and Luke's laugh and a temper that could crack glass. Sometimes when she's asleep on my chest, I remember the version of me that thought motherhood would end everything. That people would see the belly and stop seeing the brain. And to be fair, they did. But only for a while. Long enough for me to see the truth. Their blindness was never my burden. Reforge is no longer a startup. It's an institution. We've placed over 1,000 women in roles they once thought were off limits. We've trained hiring teams, audited boardrooms, and rewritten what return to work means in 5 industries. We launched a fund, to a small one for now, seed capital for mothers with ideas and no runway. We don't require pitch decks, just proof of thought and fire. It's the thing I wish I'd had. The thing no one thought we'd build. But we did. Quietly, relentlessly. People often ask me if I've forgiven them, my old company, the CEO, the system. I never quite know how to answer. Forgiveness is a word built for churches and therapists. What I've done feels different. I've stopped bleeding. That's enough. I don't need them to be sorry. I don't need them to change. I just needed to no longer need them. And I don't. Not for validation, not for funding, not for anything. Sometimes I get messages from women who followed the Reforge journey from day one. They write to say thank you, to tell me they went back to work after 2 years, that they renegotiated their return packages, that they built teams while nursing, while healing, while surviving. One woman told me she left a company that asked her to wait until her life calmed down. and instead joined one of our partners, and now she leads product for a team of 12. She said I stopped waiting to be allowed back in. And I think about that sentence all the time. Because we've all done that, haven't we? Waited. For permission, for timing, for someone to make room for us. I'm done waiting. And now, so are they. I go for walks most mornings. I bring my daughter sometimes, bundled in a stroller with wheels that hate gravel. The air out here is different, less ambition in it. More sky, more space to be. And on those walks, I often think of the day I was fired. Not with rage, not even regret. Just as a fact, a hinge point. The day someone thought they could end me with a single decision. But the thing they never understood was this. You can't erase a woman who was never trying to be visible in their frame. I wasn't building to impress them. I was building to outlive them. And I did.